August 7th, 1942. Dawn breaks over the Solomon Islands. The air is thick with salt and gunpowder. On Guadalcanal's blood-soaked beaches, the smell of cordite mingles with rotting jungle vegetation and the metallic tang of death. Japanese soldiers lie scattered across the sand, some breathing, most not. The palm trees, once pristine, are now splintered into jagged teeth by naval bombardment. In the half-light, a young Imperial Japanese Navy sailor named Takeshi Yamamoto watches American Marines approach through the smoke, their rifles raised, but their faces strangely calm. He expects a bayonet. He expects execution. He has been told since childhood that capture means dishonor worse than death, that the American devils show no mercy to the vanquished. Instead, one Marine kneels beside him, checks his wounds, and offers him water from a canteen. Takeshi's hands tremble as he takes it. This moment, replicated across 1,000 battlefields in the Pacific, would shatter everything Imperial Japan had taught its sons about their enemy. For decades, the Japanese Empire had constructed an elaborate mythology about the West, and particularly about Americans. In Tokyo's military academies, instructors taught that Americans were soft, decadent, corrupted by democracy and individualism. They were a mongrel race, the propaganda claimed, weakened by jazz music, Hollywood films, and an obsession with material comfort. Japanese soldiers were told that Americans had no warrior spirit, no concept of honor, no willingness to suffer. The Americans would collapse at the first sign of hardship, retreat at the first casualty. Most crucially, Japanese troops were indoctrinated to believe that surrender to such an enemy would result in torture, mutilation, and degradation. The Imperial Military Code, the Senjin-kun, explicitly forbade capture. Death was preferable. Death was honorable. Surrender was not merely defeat, but spiritual annihilation. These beliefs were not casual prejudices, but carefully cultivated state doctrine, drilled into every soldier from the moment they received their conscription papers. The contrast between expectation and reality would prove devastating to the Japanese worldview. When the first prisoners were taken at Guadalcanal, they arrived at American lines expecting immediate execution. Some had already attempted suicide. Others had hidden hand grenades, planning to take their captors with them in a final act of defiance. Instead, they were disarmed gently, given medical treatment, and escorted to prisoner-of-war camps that defied every warning they had received. At Camp Tracy in California, at Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, at dozens of facilities across the American mainland and Pacific bases. Japanese POWs encountered something their training had never prepared them for: systematic, humane treatment. They were fed 3 meals a day. They received medical care that exceeded what many had known in their own military. They were housed in barracks with heating in winter, cooling in summer. And most bewildering of all, they were treated not as subhuman devils to be crushed, but as human beings who had happened to be on the opposite side of a war. The first meal was always the moment of deepest confusion. At Camp McCoy in the winter of 1942, a group of naval aviators shot down during the Midway campaign sat in a mess hall staring at their trays. Before them lay portions that seemed impossible: beef stew with actual chunks of meat, white bread with butter, canned peaches, coffee with sugar. One pilot, Lieutenant Kazuo Sakamaki, who had been the first Japanese POW captured in the war after his midget submarine ran aground at Pearl Harbor, would later write in his memoir that he thought the meal was a trick. He believed the Americans were fattening them up before some elaborate torture. He ate slowly, waiting for guards to strike him. They never did. Instead, American soldiers sat at nearby tables, eating the same food, laughing among themselves, occasionally nodding politely at the prisoners. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. These were the same men who had killed his comrades hours or days before. How could they sit and laugh? How could they share food with the enemy? This pattern repeated across the Pacific theater with remarkable consistency. After the brutal fighting on Saipan in June 1944, Where Japanese soldiers and civilians had committed mass suicide rather than face capture, the few hundred who did surrender found themselves in field hospitals receiving the same medical attention as wounded Marines. Doctors operated on Japanese soldiers with the same care they gave Americans. Nurses changed bandages, administered morphine, spoke kindly even when their patients couldn't understand English. One captured officer, Major Yoshitaka Hori, later testified that he watched an American surgeon work for 6 hours to save the leg of a Japanese private who had been shot in the femur. The surgeon succeeded. The private lived. Hori could not reconcile this with what he had been taught. If Americans were devils, why would they exhaust themselves saving an enemy soldier's leg? The evidence of American abundance became a recurring source of psychological disruption for Japanese POWs. In Japan, by 1943, civilians were surviving on rations of rice mixed with sawdust, sweet potato vines, and acorns. Soldiers at the front were often on starvation rations, subsisting on spoiled rice and whatever they could forage from the jungle. The imperial military had told them that America, too, was suffering, that the war was draining their resources, that any day the soft Americans would beg for peace. Then, the prisoners arrived at camps where guards threw away half-eaten sandwiches, where mess halls discarded pounds of food daily, where the quartermaster issued new clothing without a thought. At the interrogation center in Brisbane, Australia, one intelligence officer recorded the reaction of a captured sergeant from the 18th Army who broke down weeping when given a chocolate bar. The sergeant had not tasted sugar in 2 years. He had watched his entire unit die of starvation in New Guinea, chewing on tree bark in their final days. The casual abundance of his captors broke something fundamental in his understanding of the war. The symbolism of food became inescapable. In Japanese military culture, suffering and deprivation were seen as purifying, as proof of spiritual strength. Soldiers were expected to endure starvation as a test of will. But here were the Americans, who never seemed to go hungry, who had enough to spare, and who were winning. The equation did not work. If deprivation led to strength, why were the starving Japanese losing to the well-fed Americans? The question haunted many prisoners. Some concluded that they had been lied to. Others spiraled into depression, unable to process the contradiction. A few embraced it and became some of the most cooperative prisoners of the war, volunteering information, even agreeing to broadcast surrender appeals to Japanese troops still fighting. Beyond food, the treatment itself became transformative. The Geneva Conventions were applied, even though Japan had not ratified them. Prisoners were allowed to write letters home, though few could bring themselves to do so, knowing the shame their families would feel. They were given work assignments that paid small wages in camp scrip, which could be used to buy toiletries, cigarettes, and candy. They organized baseball leagues, study groups, and religious services. At Camp Livingston in Louisiana, Japanese prisoners built an elaborate Japanese garden with a koi pond, using materials provided by the camp administration. The symbolism was profound. The enemy was allowing them to recreate a piece of home, to maintain their culture, even as prisoners. The transformation in perception was not immediate or universal, but it was real. Interviews conducted after the war by American occupation authorities revealed a consistent pattern. Prisoners who had spent years in American custody expressed shock at the gap between what they had been told and what they had experienced. They spoke of American guards who showed them photographs of their own families, who asked about Japanese customs with genuine curiosity, who treated them as fellow human beings caught in a vast and terrible conflict. One former prisoner, Sergeant Toshio Tamura, told interviewers in 1946 that the moment he began to question everything was when an American guard gave him a cigarette and lit it for him. It was a small gesture, almost meaningless, but in the context of the Bushido Code and the propaganda he had internalized, it was revolutionary. The enemy was supposed to be cruel, inhuman, barbaric. This guard was none of those things. The contrast with Japanese treatment of Allied POWs made the cognitive dissonance even more severe. By 1945, as Japan collapsed, some prisoners began to hear rumors of what their own side had done. The Bataan Death March, the Burma Railway, Unit 731, the systematic starvation and abuse of American, British, Australian, and Filipino prisoners. The survival rate for Allied POWs in Japanese hands was 37%. In American hands, it was approaching 99%. When these statistics filtered through the camps, the psychological impact was devastating. Some prisoners refused to believe it. Others fell into silence. A few attempted suicide, unable to bear the shame. The mythology had inverted. They were not the honorable warriors defending civilization against barbarians. They had been the barbarians. American military planners had understood from early in the war that humane treatment of prisoners was not merely a moral obligation, but a strategic weapon. The Office of War Information produced leaflets promising good treatment to any Japanese soldier who surrendered. These leaflets were dismissed as lies by most Japanese troops, but the few who did surrender and survived became living proof. Some were even convinced to make recordings that were broadcast over loudspeakers to Japanese positions. The success rate was low. Japanese indoctrination ran too deep, but each surrender was a crack in the wall of fanaticism. By 1945, surrender rates were increasing, not dramatically, but noticeably. On Okinawa, where Japanese resistance was ferocious, still several thousand soldiers chose to surrender rather than die. Many cited the treatment of earlier prisoners as a factor in their decision. The laughter was perhaps the most alien element. Japanese military culture was austere, hierarchical, and deadly serious. American military culture, by contrast, incorporated humor, informality, and a degree of egalitarianism that Japanese soldiers found incomprehensible. At camps across America, prisoners watched American guards joke with each other, mock their officers, listen to music, and play cards. They saw African American and white soldiers working side by side, a sight that contradicted everything Japanese propaganda had said about American racial hatred. They observed women in uniform giving orders to men, another impossibility according to their worldview. The ease with which Americans moved through the world, their casual confidence, their ability to find humor even in war. All of it suggested a society operating on principles completely foreign to imperial. Japan. Daden, one recurring account from multiple prisoners, describes a scene at Camp Shelby in Mississippi. In the summer of 1944, a group of Japanese POWs was being escorted to a work detail when they passed a group of American soldiers playing softball. One American hit a ball that rolled toward the prisoners. A Japanese soldier instinctively picked it up. The American jogged over, said thank you, and tossed it back to the game. The Japanese soldier stood frozen. In the Imperial Army, such casual interaction between ranks, let alone with a prisoner, would have been unthinkable. The guard escorting the prisoners just shrugged and told them to keep moving. The Japanese soldier who had picked up the ball told a chaplain later that he could not stop thinking about that moment. The American had said thank you to him, a prisoner, an enemy, a man who might have killed Americans on the battlefield. The casual humanity of it haunted him. The transformation was not universal. Some prisoners remained committed to imperial ideology until the end. They organized resistance within the camps, attacking prisoners they deemed collaborators, refusing to cooperate with camp authorities, maintaining rigid military hierarchy and discipline. At Camp McCoy, hardline officers maintained a secret court system, punishing prisoners who they felt had violated the code of Bushido. Several prisoners were beaten, and at least one was murdered by his fellow captives for being too friendly with American guards. The psychological pressure was immense. Even prisoners who had privately rejected the old ideology often conformed outwardly, terrified of being labeled a traitor. But the numbers tell a story. By the end of the war, American intelligence had recruited hundreds of Japanese POWs to serve as translators, interrogators, and propaganda broadcasters. These men, known as Nisei soldiers from Japanese-American families and cooperative POWs, played crucial roles in the final year of the Pacific War. They translated captured documents, interrogated prisoners, and broadcast surrender appeals. Some even participated in combat operations, infiltrating Japanese lines to gather intelligence. Their cooperation was born from the experience of capture, from the realization that they had been lied to, that the enemy was not what they had been told. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, prisoners in American camps heard the news before most Japanese civilians. Their reactions varied. Some celebrated, seeing it as divine retribution for Japanese militarism. Others wept for their homeland. Many simply felt numb. The war was over. They had survived. But what did survival mean? They could not return to Japan as prisoners of war. The shame would be unbearable. Their families might disown them. Some chose to remain in America after the war, building new lives in a country that had been their enemy. Others returned to Japan and spent decades hiding their POW status, carrying the secret like a scar. The epilogue to this story is written in the memoirs, the interviews, the quiet testimonies of men who lived through the inversion of their world. They had been taught that strength came from deprivation, that honor required death, that the enemy was subhuman. They learned instead that strength could coexist with abundance, that survival could be honorable, and that humanity was not bounded by national or racial lines. The American soldiers who sat beside them, who shared their food, who laughed in the face of death, were not weaker for their comfort or their democracy. They were, in fact, stronger. The abundance was not decadence, but proof of a system that produced enough for all. The laughter was not frivolity, but the sound of men who believed they were fighting for something worth preserving, a way of life that included joy, not just duty. In the end, the most devastating weapon America deployed against Japanese ideology was not the atomic bomb or the aircraft carrier or the Marine Corps. It was the simple act of treating captured enemies as human beings. It was the meal shared, the wound bandaged, the cigarette offered. These small gestures, replicated across thousands of interactions, did more to undermine the mythology of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere than any propaganda campaign. They revealed the lie at the heart of Japanese militarism, that cruelty was strength, that suffering was virtue, that the individual existed only to serve the state. The Americans demonstrated an alternative, a society wealthy enough to feed its enemies, confident enough to laugh in war, and principled enough to extend dignity even to those who had tried to kill them. The prisoners carried this knowledge back to Japan, where it would simmer through the occupation years and the Reconstruction. It would inform the new Japan that emerged, democratic and prosperous, allied with its former enemy. The transformation was not complete or perfect, but it was real, and it began with those first bewildered moments on Guadalcanal's beaches, when men expecting death received water instead, and the world they thought they knew began to crumble. The sound of American laughter, echoing across a mess hall, became the sound of an ideology dying, and perhaps, in its own way, the first notes of a new future being born.